Hey everyone, I hope you're doing really well. Thank you so much for joining me for the latest episode of the Withstand podcast. As you're no doubt aware, we're currently working our way through the Gospel of Matthew. We're up to chapter 27, and today we turn our focus to the balance of chapter 27, where we see Jesus crucified. But before we begin, I just wanted to share with you this wonderful tweet that seems to be going viral at the moment. I don't know the woman's name, but I know that she was being interviewed on a podcast by Lara Logan. I've heard Lara's name. I don't really know all that much about her, but in I guess a nutshell from that podcast, the woman said, "If you knew what the dead know, you'd accept Jesus," which is such a powerful statement, and it's one that I pray everybody who's listening to this, all of my extended family, friends, acquaintances, former colleagues, you name it, I pray that they would know that this side of passing away, that's for sure, because it's an incredibly powerful statement. If you knew what the dead know now, you would accept Jesus. Yeah, God bless her for doing that. And so fantastic to see that going viral throughout many social media channels at the moment. I pray that that moves lots of people, including your own loved ones who you're no doubt praying for as well. Now, we are up to Matthew 27, and Jesus has just been led away to be crucified, and we're picking up in verse 32. And this is God's word. Now as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross, and when they had come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, place of a skull, they gave him sour wine mingled with gall to drink, but when he had tasted it, he would not drink. Then they crucified him, and divided his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Sitting down, they kept watch over him there, and they put up over his head the accusation written against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and another on the left. And those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Likewise the chief priests, also mocking with the scribes and elders, said, "He saved others, himself he cannot save. If he is the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe him. He trusted in God, let him deliver him now if he will have him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" Even the robbers who were crucified with him reviled him with the same thing. Now from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was a darkness over all the land. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some of those who stood there when they heard that said, "This man is calling for Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and offered it to him to drink. The rest said, "Let him alone. Let us see if Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. So when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that had happened, they feared greatly, saying, "Truly this was the Son of God." And many women who followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, were there looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joses, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. Now when evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea, named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded the body to be given to him. When Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and laid it in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the door of the tomb, and departed. And Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary sitting opposite the tomb. On the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, saying, "Sir, we remember while he was still alive, how that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.' So the last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard. Go your way, make it as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard. This is the gospel of the Lord. Dr Thomas Constable writes the following about the crucifixion and mockery of Jesus. The over-enthusiastic attempts to draw out the physical horror of crucifixion which disfigures some Christian preaching and at least one recent movie find no echo in the Gospels. Perhaps the original readers were too familiar with both the torture and the shame of crucifixion to need any help in envisaging what it really meant. At any rate, the narrative focus in these verses is rather on the surrounding events and the people involved: Simon, the soldiers, the bandits, together with the ironical placard over Jesus' head which sums up the Roman dismissal of his claims. Matthew's emphasis in his account of Jesus' crucifixion was on the mocking of the onlookers. Matthew's original readers would have understood what was involved in crucifixion only too well, but because this form of execution is less understood today, I have included more information about it below. Jesus was able to carry the crossbeam of his cross until he passed through the city gate. Normally crucifixions took place outside the city wall. This location symbolized added rejection. Criminals were executed outside the walls of the city for Jewish and Roman reasons, to protect the Jewish city from the impurity of death and the shame of crucifixion, and because the Romans wanted to advertise what happened to condemned traitors crucified on the major road leading in and out of the city. Simon's name is Jewish. He came from the town of Cyrene, near modern Tripoli in Libya, on the Mediterranean coast of North Africa. The Roman soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. Perhaps Matthew mentioned this because it is another piece of irony. Jesus was really bearing Simon's spiritual cross by dying in his place. The reader understands this, but at the time, things look completely the opposite to onlookers. Simon was carrying Jesus' cross. Another reason that Matthew may have mentioned Simon by name is that he may have been well known among the early Christians. Ironically, Simon Peter should have been present to help Jesus in view of his previous boasts, but a different Simon had to take his place. The Muslim teaching that Simon took Jesus' place and died on the cross evidently rests on the teaching of Basilides, a 2nd century Gnostic heretic. The word Golgotha is a Greek transliteration of the Aramaic Golgotha, meaning skull. This site was most likely named not because of the shape of the landscape, but because skulls were prevalent there. Early Christian and pagan writers such as Justin Martyr, Juvenal and Seneca give horrific detail about the act of crucifixion, stating that the flesh of bodies of those crucified was often consumed by birds and wild animals, with the bones left to fall to the ground, thus accounting for skulls there. Nowhere in the Gospels is Golgotha called a hill. The word Calvary comes from the Latin calva, meaning skull. The exact location of Golgotha is unknown. It was evidently north of the old city wall of Jerusalem, probably not far from the site of the present Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Edersheim believed that the site was very close to the present Damascus Gate. Gordon's Calvary, which is not far from the Damascus Gate, does not enjoy much support as a site from scholars anymore. The traditional Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrow, the route from Jesus' trial before Pilate to the site of his crucifixion, rests on the assumption that Jesus' trial before Pilate took place in the Antonia fortress. Perhaps some women offered Jesus some wine to drink, to which they had added bile in order to decrease his pain. Matthew wrote bile, or gall or wormwood, which probably refers to the bitter taste of myrrh, and to make the fulfillment of Psalm 69 verses 20 and 21 clearer. Jesus refused it after tasting it because he chose to enjoy his crucifixion fully conscious. A better explanation is that the soldiers, not some women, offered the drink to Jesus as an act of mockery, since wine mixed with myrrh was a delicacy that kings drank, and Jesus had claimed to be a king. The Romans normally tied or nailed the victim of crucifixion to the crossbeam of his cross. In Jesus' case, they nailed him. They would then hoist the crossbeam and the prisoner up onto the upright member of the cross. The upright was 6 feet tall. This would accommodate most criminals because the knees were arranged in a buckle position. They had another cross, rarely used, which was called crux sublimis, and this was much taller, but was only used on personages whom the Romans wanted to display. Next, the soldiers would fasten the crucified person's feet to the upright by tying them with a rope or nailing them with a square 5-inch nail. With his right hand, the executioner probed the wrist of Jesus to find the little hollow spot. The nails were never put in the hands. When he found it, he took one of the square-cut iron nails from his teeth and held it against the spot directly behind where the so-called lifeline ends. Then he raised the hammer over the nail head and brought it down with force. The ritual was to nail the right foot over the left, and this was probably the most difficult part of the work. If the feet were pulled downward and nailed close to the foot of the cross, the prisoner always died quickly. Over the years, the Romans learned to push the feet upward on the cross so that the condemned man could lean on the nails and stretch himself upward. The Romans constructed crosses in various shapes, an X or T, or as in Jesus' case, the traditional T with the upright extending above the crossbeam. Sometimes the victim was only a few inches off the ground, but Jesus appeared to have been a few feet higher. For a time, the Romans used a small pointed saddle called the sedile or the sedere crus. This was nailed beneath the pelvis of the criminal, and as his fatigue increased, he intended to try to rest on the point of it. It was used on occasion in the time of Seneca, who died in AD 65, but it did not merit this extra time its use entailed, and it was abandoned. Normally, the Romans crucified their victims naked, except for a loincloth. The 4 executioners took the criminal's clothes for themselves. These would have been his sandals, his turban, his girdle or sash, his inner garment, and his outer cloak or robe. The probability is that Jesus had been stripped absolutely naked. Heavy stuff. In Jesus' case, the soldiers cast lots for his garments, fulfilling Psalm 22. This happened in the late morning on Friday. In the case of Jesus, we have reason to think that while the mode of punishment to which he was subjected was un-Jewish, every concession would be made to Jewish custom, and hence we thankfully believe that on the cross he was spared the indignity of exposure, which was nudity. Such would have been truly un-Jewish. When the prisoners were naked, a cloth was wound around their loins and between the thighs, with the loose end tucked in at the back. Muslims believe that God took Jesus to heaven before he died and that he will come back to earth to finish his work. As previously mentioned, they believe that it was Simon of Cyrene who died on the cross. Crucifixion was unspeakably painful and degrading. Whether tied or nailed to the cross, the victim endured countless paroxysms, which are spasms, as he pulled with his arms and pushed with his legs to keep his chest cavity open for breathing, and then collapsed in exhaustion until the demand for oxygen demanded renewed paroxysms. The scourging, the loss of blood, the shock from the pain, all produced agony that could go on for days, ending at last by suffocation, cardiac arrest, or loss of blood. When there was reason to hasten death, the execution squad would smash the victim's legs. Death followed almost immediately, either from shock or from collapse that cut off breathing. The Romans reserved crucifixion for the worst criminals from the lowest classes of society. Roman citizens were exempt from crucifixion unless Caesar himself ordered it. For the Jews, crucifixion was even more horrible because it symbolized a person dying under God's curse. Israel's leaders hung up those who had died under God's curse for others to see and learn from. Jesus bore God's curse for the sins of humankind so that people would not have to experience that curse. This verse is unique to the first gospel. Sometimes people took criminals down from their crosses to prevent them from dying. The soldiers guarded Jesus in order to prevent this from happening. Jesus really did die. No one rescued him. Often the Romans wrote the charge against the crucified criminal on a white tablet with red or black ink and attached it to his cross. Pilate had Jesus' charge written in Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. He meant it to be insulting to the Jews. The title King of the Jews meant Messiah to the Jews. Pilate meant that Jesus was a messianic pretender, but of course, he was indeed the Messiah. Pilate ironically stated what Matthew wanted his readers to understand, that Jesus was the Messiah that the Old Testament had predicted, namely the Son of God and the suffering servant. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews, is actually the theme of the book, though it here is used in sheer derision. The full accusation compiled by comparing the various gospel accounts was evidently, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." In one sense, this title proved to be the first gospel tract ever written. I regard this verse as the key verse in Matthew's gospel because it states concisely Matthew's whole message. The two men crucified with Jesus were guerrilla freedom fighters, or rebels, not simply robbers. Jesus, the true Messiah, hung between two men who wanted to bring in Messiah's kingdom through violent action against Israel's enemies, contrary to God's will. Matthew may have had Isaiah 53 in mind when he wrote this verse. He was counted with wrongdoers. The Romans crucified people publicly so they would be an example to others. Evidently, the site of Jesus' crucifixion was close to a road. Israel's leaders had charged Jesus with being a blasphemer because of his claim to be the one that they would see seated at God's right hand. Matthew pointed out that the people passing by were really the ones speaking abusively, blaspheming. Since they charged Jesus unjustly, their derision fulfilled prophecy. These blasphemers continued to question Jesus' identity. Like Satan, they tempted him to show who he was by demonstrating his identity in a way that was contrary to God's will. "If you are the Son of God" is a challenge that Jesus heard at the commencement and the consummation of his ministry, and it fitly expressed the problem of Jesus' identity that everyone during that ministry had to answer. Here Matthew showed the Jews mocking Jesus as the Romans had done earlier. The chief priests, scribes, and elders represented all segments of the Sanhedrin. They all mocked Jesus, probably with words that Jesus heard. The reference to Jesus having saved others probably goes back to his healing ministry. The religious leaders intended to throw doubt on Jesus' healing ministry by claiming that he could not even change his own miserable condition. Perhaps these Jerusalemites were also recalling Jesus' triumphal entry and the cries of his mainly Galilean followers, "Hosanna!" Of course, Jesus could have saved himself from his suffering on the cross, but he could not have done so and still provided salvation for humankind. In one sense, the religious leaders spoke the truth. The critics continued to point out Jesus' apparent helplessness. They implied that their failure to believe on Jesus was his fault. They promised to believe in him if he would come down off the cross. If he had done so, there would have been no salvation for anyone. They may also have been deliberately ridiculing the belief of the simple Galileans who had become his disciples. The leaders were probably unwittingly quoting Psalm 22. They meant that God's failure to rescue Jesus proved that God did not delight in him. Jesus' claims to be God's son were therefore pretentious in their sight. Note that these critics knew that Jesus claimed to be God's son. God would identify his son by delivering him from death, but not in the way that the religious leaders supposed. Presently, God had to turn his back on his son. Technically, Jesus never said, "I am the Son of God," but he did say that one day he would sit at the right hand of the power, which the chief priests interpreted as a claim to deity, thus the charge of blasphemy. The insurrectionists who were crucified with Jesus joined the others who mocked him. None of the gospel writers recorded that anyone spoke up in his defense. This section presents many different groups of people and individuals mocking Jesus: the Roman soldiers, the mob, the Jewish leaders, and the insurrectionists. The picture is of the suffering servant, totally forsaken, misunderstood, and rejected by everyone. Yet through all this, Jesus fulfilled the prophecies about Messiah. As the leaders see it, Jesus threatens the overthrow of law and tradition and the destruction of the nation. In claiming to be the Son of God and the decisive figure in the history of salvation, Jesus makes himself guilty of blasphemy against God and is deserving of death. Accordingly, in effecting the death of Jesus, the leaders understand themselves to be purging Israel of the error with which a false Messiah would pervert the nation. The irony, however, is that in abjectly repudiating Jesus, the leaders achieve the opposite of what they had intended. Far from purging Israel from error, they plunge it into fatal error, for they make both themselves and the people responsible for the death of the one who is in fact the Son of God and through whom God proffers salvation to Israel. Unwittingly, therefore, the leaders make themselves responsible for Israel's temporal loss of its privileged place among the nations as God's chosen people. Matthew now turned his spotlight away from the observers of Jesus onto Jesus himself. The land of Canaan became abnormally dark from noon until 3 p.m. This was quite clearly an unusual, literal darkening of the sky. It could not have resulted from a solar eclipse because the Passover was celebrated at full moon. Matthew's use of gi, or land, probably implies the people of the land as well as the land itself. Darkness in Scripture often represents judgment and or tragedy. Compare the 3 days of darkness in Egypt and the 3 hours of darkness here. Matthew's description of this darkness conveys a strong sense of impending disaster. This was a judgment on Israel and its people. Their true king was dying, but it was also a judgment on Jesus. His cry of desolation came out of this darkness. This was a time of judgment on Jesus for the sins of all humanity, though he himself was sinless. An extraordinary light gave intelligence of the birth of Christ, and therefore it was proper that an extraordinary darkness should notify his death, for he is the light of the world. Jesus cried out the words of Psalm 22 because he felt like his Father was abandoning him when he became a sin offering for us and bore God's full wrath against humankind's sins. It was out of a similar sense of abandonment by God that David originally wrote the words of this psalm that Jesus quoted. The psalm expresses the spiritual desolation of a man who continues to trust and to appeal to God in spite of the fact that his ungodly opponents mock and persecute him with impunity. It seems clear that God the Father did not forsake Jesus as he hung on the cross, any more than he forsook David, but the feeling of separation from the Father that Jesus felt must have been the worst part of the cross for him, since he had never before experienced anything but intimate fellowship with his Father. Since Jesus was God, I do not believe that he experienced actual separation from God, the Father. However, when the Father poured out his wrath on his Son, who took upon himself the sins of the world, the relationship between the Father and the Son became different than it had been. Jesus became the focal point of God's judgment on mankind's sin. Here Jesus was bearing the sins of the whole world, and even God the Father had to turn away as Jesus bore the curse and identified himself with the sins of the whole world. When Jesus actually died, he commended himself back into the Father's hands. The NASB has Eli, Eli, a transliteration of the Hebrew word that mean my God, my God. The NIV has Eloi, Eloi, which are the Aramaic words that mean the same thing. Probably the NIV is correct here. Jesus evidently quoted these words in Aramaic, the language commonly spoken in the land of Israel. The remaining words, lama sabachthani, are also Aramaic. Matthew translated Jesus' Aramaic words into Greek, or perhaps a later copyist made the change. By comparing the Gospel accounts, we know that Jesus spoke 7 times while hanging on the cross. First he said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Second, he told one of the rebels who was crucified with him, Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Third, he told his mother, Woman, behold your son. And he told his disciple John, Behold your mother. Fourth, he cried, my God, why have you forsaken me? Fifth, he said, I am thirsty. Sixth, he exclaimed, It is finished. Seventh, he cried, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. And that's it of the 7. Perhaps some onlookers who were standing nearby misunderstood Eloi as a call for Elijah. There was a common belief that Elijah, whom God had taken to heaven without dying, would come to rescue the righteous from their distress. There is no biblical basis for this idea, though some Jews held it. Perhaps it had some connection with the prophecy about Elijah's return to herald Messiah's appearing. Evidently one of the onlookers, possibly one of the soldiers, took another opportunity to mock Jesus further. The Greek word translated sour wine or wine vinegar is oxos and means vinegar. It probably describes the wine that the soldiers strengthened with vinegar and drank themselves. It had a calming effect. By giving this drink to Jesus, this person really lengthened his sufferings. It was not a profession of compassion to offer Jesus the drink, but it was really another act of brutality. John reported that just after Jesus tasted the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." So perhaps Jesus wetted his parched lips with the liquid so that he could utter his final words. The other onlookers waited to see if Elijah would come and save Jesus. Jesus cried out again loudly in his agony, "It is finished." This was his 6th utterance on the cross. Then followed his 7th and final statement, "Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit." Shortly thereafter he dismissed his spirit. What animated his life? Matthew's description of the moment of Jesus' death again shows that Jesus had sovereign control over his own life. Jesus demonstrated his kingly authority even with his dying breath. He did not commit suicide like Judas had done, but he laid down his life in self-sacrifice for the sins of humankind. The Greek words used here and in James 19, I'm not sure what that is, sorry guys. The Greek words here are unique in the New Testament. In 15 other Bible verses, "gave up the Spirit" or "yielded up the Spirit" is used to translate a single Hebrew or Greek word meaning breathe out or expire. This is true of the description of the death of Jesus in Mark. But in Matthew, alone with these expressions translates a Greek phrase of the two words meaning give over the Spirit or deliver up the Spirit. The death of Jesus was different from that of any other man. No one could take his life from him except as he was willing to permit it. Christ chose to die so that we might live. Where did the pneuma of Jesus go after his death? Into his Father's hands, into paradise with the malefactor, into the glory the Son had from eternity. These expressions refer to heaven, the eternal abode of God and of his angels and the saints. According to Andrew's chronology, Jesus died on April 7 AD 30. Honer's date for the crucifixion was April 3rd AD 33. Interesting. Some interpreters believe that the veil in view here separated the holy place from the most holy place. According to Jewish tradition, there were indeed 2 veils before the entrance to the most holy place. One veil hung on the side of the holy, the other on that of the most holy place. The veils before the most holy place were 40 cubits long and 20 wide, of the thickness of the palm of the hand. This veil was a most elaborately woven fabric of 72 twisted plaits of 24 threads each. A wooden partition separated the most holy from the holy place, and over the door hung the veil, which was rent in twain from the top to the bottom when the way into the holiest of all was opened on Golgotha. The rabbis speak of 2 veils and say that the high priest went in by the southern edge of the first veil, then walked along till he reached the northern corner of the second veil, by which he entered the most holy place. These descriptions are hard to harmonize with the impression that this verse presents. The veil. Perhaps both veils tore, if they were indeed 2 at this time, and the singular veil is meant to be understood in a collective sense. Or perhaps the more important of the 2 veils is meant. A better solution seems to be that the veil in view here was the one that separated the holy place from the temple courtyard. The tearing happened at 3 p.m., the time of the evening incense offering. A priest would normally have been standing in the holy place offering incense when it tore. Some early non-biblical Jewish sources also report unusual phenomena in the temple 40 years before its destruction in AD 70, one of which is the temple curtain tearing. The fact that this occurred from top to bottom signified that God is the one who ripped the thick curtain. It was not torn from the bottom by men ripping. This was a supernatural act that symbolized the opening of access to God and the termination of the Mosaic system of worship. The death of Jesus and the tearing of the veil marked the end of the old Mosaic covenant and the beginning to the new covenant. Jesus himself now replaced the temple as the place where people worship God. He also became the great high priest of his people. The torn veil also prefigured the physical destruction of the whole temple complex, which was a necessary corollary to its spiritual uselessness from then on. Earthquakes often accompany divine judgments, and the manifestation of God's glory in the Old Testament This one may have been responsible for the tearing of the temple veil, the splitting of the rocks, and the opening of the tombs. The temple stood on a geological fault that has caused minor damage throughout history. The supernatural occurrences that accompanied Jesus' crucifixion hinted at its important spiritual implications. One writer suggested that the sentence begun in verse 51 should really end with, were opened or broke open. There were no punctuation marks in the original Greek text. If the text is read this way, the two events that accompanied the earthquake were the rending of the temple veil and the splitting of the rocks. These first two things happened when Jesus died. The resurrection of the saints that Matthew described here must have happened later, when Jesus arose from the dead. This explanation does away with the problem of people coming out of their graves when Jesus died, but not showing themselves until he arose. Matthew did not answer many questions that we would like answers to, such as what type of bodies those saints had, and whether they died again or went directly to heaven. They were Old Testament saints, believers who lived and died before Jesus' crucifixion. I suspect that they experienced the same type of resurrection that Lazarus and the other people whom Jesus brought back to life did, namely resuscitation with death following later. Some, however, have believed that they arose as Jesus did, to die no more. Perhaps the reason that Matthew mentioned their resurrections here was to help us readers appreciate the fact that Jesus' death provided the basis for the resurrection of believers who died before the cross as well as after it. Maybe he placed it here also in order to avoid breaking the narrative flow of chapter 28 and to connect Jesus' death immediately with resurrection. The king had authority over life and death. 3 points are significant here. First, Matthew is depicting in graphic terms that the entire creation was impacted by Jesus' death. Second, the eeriness of the entire scene, combined with the cosmic darkness, makes the idea and association of appearances from the dead less strange. Third, the release of people from the grave is proleptic, or anticipatory, picture of the saving impact of Jesus' death. This event is nowhere explained in the scriptures, but seems to be a fulfillment of the feast of the first fruits of harvest mentioned in Leviticus 23. On that occasion, as a token of the coming harvest, the people would bring a handful of grain to the priest. The resurrection of these saints, occurring after Jesus himself was raised, is a token of the coming harvest when all the saints will be raised. What the centurion and the other soldiers meant when they called Jesus the Son of God depends somewhat on who they were and what their background was. The centurion was a Roman soldier responsible for 100 men, not that many guarded Jesus at the cross. The other soldiers with this centurion may have been Romans from outside Palestine, or possibly Gentile residents of the land who served in the army. They probably meant that Jesus was a divine being in a pagan sense, a son of God rather than the Son of God. If so, they spoke more truly than they knew. Literally, the Greek text says, truly of God, a son was this. On the other hand, Matthew may have included the testimony of this centurion because he had become a believer in Jesus. We would like to think that he had, but we cannot be sure. The centurion would have been required to say that the emperor was the Son of God, but now he was attributing this title to Jesus. The darkness, earthquake, and Jesus' manner of dying convinced these hardened soldiers that this was no ordinary execution. They seem to have reacted superstitiously and fearfully. Matthew recorded the centurion's comment as another ironical testimony to Jesus' messianic identity. Here Gentiles testified to the true identity of Israel's Messiah, whom the Jews had rejected. In declaring Jesus to be the Son of God, the Roman soldiers think about him as God thinks about him. Accordingly, their evaluative point of view concerning Jesus' identity can be seen to be in alignment with that of God. 2 consequences flow from this. The first is that this soldier's acclamation becomes a place in Matthew's plot, where Jesus is, for the first time, both correctly and publicly affirmed by humans to be the Son of God. And the second consequence is that, as a result of the soldier's acclamation, the way is in principle now open for the task of going and making disciples of all nations. Or, to put it differently, one could also say that the way is now open for the task of making the salvation Jesus has accomplished in his death, owing to his conflict with Israel, redound to the benefit of all humankind. Then, too, since the Roman soldiers are themselves Gentiles, they attest in this way, as well as that the time for embarking upon the universal mission is at hand. Why did Matthew include reference to the women who observed the crucifixion? Even though Jewish society did not regard women equally with men, their witness of Jesus' death would have added credibility to Matthew's account. Like Mary, the sister of Lazarus and Martha, who may have understood and believed something of what Jesus had said about his dying, these women did not abandon him like most of his unfaithful male disciples had done. The only believing disciple who did not abandon him appeared to have been a few powerless women who could not help him, but only observed his sufferings from afar, and John. These women were these women were the last at the cross and the first at the tomb, indicating their devotion to Jesus, whom they had followed in and from Galilee, and whom they had ministered to financially. Thus, one reason for this mention of the women appears to be to bridge Jesus' crucifixion and his resurrection. The women Matthew chose to identify by name, thus honouring them, were probably those whom his original readers knew best by the names he used to describe them. The chart below attempts to harmonise the references in the Gospels that identify the women who observed Jesus on the cross. And there's a terrific table there just at the bottom of 683 and 684 for you guys. Now, Dr. Thomas Constable writes about the burial of Jesus that Matthew emphasised two things about Jesus' burial: the fulfilment of prophecy and the impossibility of the theory that someone stole Jesus' body. Normally, the Romans let the bodies of crucified criminals rot on their crosses without burial. If family members wanted to bury a crucified loved one, they had to apply for permission to do so. The Romans usually granted these requests, with the exception of criminals who had committed high treason. The Jews, however, did not want dead corpses to remain unburied overnight. Evening would have been late afternoon. The next day, a Sabbath, began at sundown, which would have occurred about 6 p.m. at this time of year in Canaan. The location of Joseph's home, Arimathea, is uncertain. It may have been Ramathaim Zophim, which was located about 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem. Joseph was a member of the Sanhedrin who had not consented to Jesus' death. Matthew is the only Gospel writer who mentioned that Joseph was a rich disciple of Jesus. In the Greek text, the word translated rich is in the emphatic position in the sentence. Matthew apparently wanted to stress the fulfillment of Isaiah 53. His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death. Evidently, Joseph was a follower of Jesus from a distance, since John wrote that he was a secret one for fear of the Jews. Matthew noted that even a member of the ruling body that condemned Jesus believed on him, another testimony that he was indeed the Messiah. Joseph was bold enough to ask for Pilate for Jesus' body. The fact that Pilate allowed Joseph to bury Jesus' body shows that the governor did not think that Jesus was guilty of treason. Joseph prepared the body of Jesus for burial with the help of Nicodemus and perhaps other friends and or servants. Matthew did not mention how these men wrapped Jesus' body for burial, but simply stated that they used a clean linen cloth, which in that culture would have been expensive. This reflected their respect for Jesus. Joseph's new tomb, a sign of his wealth, was probably near the present church of the Holy Sepulchre. This area had been a stone quarry centuries earlier, out of whose walls the Jews had cut tombs. Joseph had prepared this tomb for himself, but now he put Jesus in his place. This was an extravagant act of devotion. It also symbolizes what every person needs to do with Jesus, namely count him to have taken our place as our substitute. It was impossible, humanly speaking, for Jesus to escape from a tomb cut out of solid, massive rock, even if he had been alive when placed in it. Matthew built a strong case for the reality of Jesus' resurrection, as he did for the virgin birth of Jesus. Tombs were of various kinds. Many were sealed with some sort of boulder wedged into place to discourage wild animals and grave robbers. But an expensive tomb consisted of an antechamber hewn out of the rock face with a low passage leading into the burial chamber that was sealed with a cut disc-shaped stone that rolled in a slot cut into the rock. The slot was an incline, making the grave easy to seal but difficult to open. Several men might be needed to roll a stone back up the incline. It is the most melancholy circumstance in the funerals of our Christian friends, when we have laid their bodies in the dark and silent grave, to go home and leave them behind. But alas, it is not that we go home and leave them behind. No, it is that they are gone to the better home and have left us behind. I love that. The Romans did not permit friends to mourn the deaths of executed criminals. However, the women mentioned here witnessed Jesus' burial along with Joseph and Nicodemus. Matthew's notation of what they saw prepares for chapter 28 rather. Matthew's Gospel is the only one that includes this pericope. It is a witness to the falsehood of the chief priests and the elders' claim that someone stole Jesus' body. The day to which Matthew referred was the Sabbath. He probably referred to it as he did the day after the preparation, in order to avoid the confusion that often arises when describing the Sabbaths associated with feasts. The Sanhedrin members could confer with Pilate if they did not have to travel more than a Sabbath day journey, and if they did not have to enter his residence. However, they could hardly do everything else that they did without violating the Sabbath, something they hypocritically had charged Jesus with doing. Jesus was in the tomb only about 36 hours, but because these hours spanned across parts of 3 consecutive days, the Jews counted the period as 3 days long. The fact that Jesus' prediction of his resurrection had reached the ears of these men reflects badly on the disciples' lack of faith. They should have understood and believed that Jesus would arise, since knowledge of his prediction of this event was so widespread. These Sanhedrin members did not believe that Jesus would rise. They wanted to guard against any plot that his disciples might concoct, claiming that he arose. The Jews needed Pilate's approval for any military action. Jesus' first act as a deceiver, from their viewpoint, was his messiahship, and his second was his claim that he would rise from the dead. The falsely pious chief priests and Pharisees pretended to want to protect the people from deception. Matthew viewed their action as self-deception, designed to deceive others. Pilate refused to assign his own troops to guard Jesus' tomb, but he allowed the Jewish leaders to use their temple guards for that purpose. Pilate's reply was probably cynical. These men had feared Jesus when he was alive, and now they feared his disciples after he was dead. Pilate did not think the chance that Jesus' disciples would steal his body was very great. It is as if Pilate, all unconsciously, said, "Keep Christ in the tomb, if you can." The chief priests and Pharisees secured the tomb by posting their guards at the site and by putting an official wax seal on the stone door. This pericope stresses the corruptness of Israel's rulers and their willful rejection of Jesus. It also shows that Jesus was definitely dead. The incongruous, ironical result is that the opponents took Jesus' words about rising from the dead more seriously than did the disciples. Lots of wonderful commentary there from Dr Thomas Constable, guys. I might even go back and reread through that independently, because there's a lot to digest and a lot to understand in his commentary. So I pray that was a blessing for you. I'll pop the link to those notes in the show notes, guys. What strikes me most about these passages is just how much Jesus loved us. To go through the excruciating pain and humiliation of the crucifixion, and it wasn't just a crucifixion, it was all the things leading up to it. The fact that he so willingly gave himself for our sin is loving beyond words. So today's daily devotion from Charles Stanley is titled Loved. And it's based on 1 John chapter 4 verse 16, which reads, "We have come to know and have believed the love which God has for us. God is love, and the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him." And Dr. Stanley writes, "Do you believe in the love God has for you? Do you trust his love, that it isn't like human love, which is unreliable and may wound you, but is unconditional, and he always works for your good?" The reason Jesus left his heavenly home, took the form of a bondservant, lived an impoverished and sacrificial earthly life, and then died one of the most excruciating deaths in history was to have a relationship with you. That's how much he cares about you, desires to reveal himself to you, and longs to live with you forever. You may doubt that today because you know your faults, failings, and every reason why others shouldn't care for you. The pain of rejection can go so deep that accepting God's unconditional love may be a challenge. But that doesn't change the fact that Jesus loved you deeply, or loves you rather, deeply, internally, and without fail. You absolutely cannot stop him from loving you. So stop telling yourself he doesn't. Embrace his love and love him in return. And he finishes in prayer. Jesus, sometimes I just don't feel like I deserve you, but you have made me acceptable. Help me know the fullness of your love. Amen. Guys, until next time, I'll pray for each and every one of you. And of course, I love each and every one of you too. God bless you all. Take care, and Maranatha.